how Utah and BYU have kind of diverged a bit since the days of the Mountain West Conference. Chantel Jennings with us here, college football writer and insider on all things West Coast or Best Coast. How are you?
I'm great. How are you, Bill?
Doing fine. Piece went up this morning. Good. What was kind of the genesis of this thing?
Well, so currently we're running, I believe it's 19 stories on conference realignment and just kind of really working to look at lots of different teams, lots of different conferences, different regions of the country. And then we also have a really wonderful piece from Bo Pelini up today that has, everything to do with nothing, I suppose. But yeah, we were just kind of thinking about the Mountain West in 2011 and what it meant to these two programs that made different decisions. And ultimately, I think, I don't think anyone would argue that Utah kind of has the better situation to be in a Power 5 conference during the college football playoff era is the most important thing, unless you're Notre Dame. But I just thought it was really interesting as I was diving into this that Utah is still fighting the same battle that they fought in 2007 in terms of exposure outside of sort of this Mountain West Pac-12 territory with the Pac-12 networks. And that is the one thing that BYU really got with its independence and its BYU TV deal. And so, that was kind of the genesis of my idea and where I went with the story.
It's funny you say that, Chantel, because, I tweet out yesterday that, Utah's picked to win the Pac-12 conference. And you get all these people from around the country that respond. It's amazing, too, when people that you don't have any idea who they are and don't even follow you are responding to something. People laughing that Utah's picked to win the Pac-12 conference or as a kind of a dark horse team when Phil Steele puts that out as a playoff team this year. People from the Midwest or the Southeast are going, Utah, why in the world would you do that? Which just goes to show you people in those parts of the country don't hear or see anything about Utah because the Pac-12 doesn't really go west of the Rockies. So if you're not named Oregon or USC, if you live east of the Rocky Mountains, people just kind of laugh at anybody else being mentioned as a contender in the Pac-12.
I think that's completely right. I mean, Utah played three of its 4 games in November last year on the Pac-12 networks. And so you had a large swath of the country for a team that was making its way to the Pac-12 title game that people couldn't see every weekend. That really didn't happen for, I think, any other team that played in its conference championship game last year. And so, when people are wondering, well, why didn't as many people show up to the Pac-12 title game? I mean, Santa Clara is part of that. But why didn't as many people watch it? You have to sort of look back at these other things that say, well, no one had there were fewer reasons for people to be excited about Utah simply because people didn't know about Utah. And that's kind of how it goes, I suppose.
Yeah, got to play more of those. It goes back to what we've said, too. When you get those opportunities on national TV in a Pac-12 championship game or an early season game, got to win them. You got to get that exposure. You got to win those games.
Oh, certainly. But I also think that the more opportunities you have on those sort of network shows and network TV, and the more often that you have games and highlights that are pulled into the sports centers of the world, the better off a team can be.
I'm not sure if you found, nobody can argue what Utah did joining the Pac-12 conference. They got their golden ticket and they got invited to join the country club. The BYU thing's a bit more of an interesting and conversation because, yes, they got some exposure from ESPN and got a little bit more money, too, because of that, more than they would have had they stayed in the Mountain West Conference. But, the problem that you deal with now if you're BYU, Chantel, is you've got to unbalance your schedule from a scheduling standpoint. You end up playing a lot of Mountain West Conference teams, and once you've lost a game or two, you're not really playing for anything anymore. When you talk to BYU folks, and I don't know if Tom Holmoe made himself available or it was just a release or a quote maybe he sent you, but it's an interesting discussion among BYU fans. Should we play in a conference or should we not play in a conference? What was kind of, when you talk to BYU folks, what was the read you got? Because I know what the university stance is.
Yeah, I think if a Power 5 option were available, that would, be a pretty easy decision for them. And you're right, they do end up sort of playing a quasi-Mountain West schedule. But I think the hardest thing for them is because of how conference realignment restructuring happened, with a lot of conferences expanding to play maybe one more conference game, move it up to 9 every year, they ultimately end up playing a huge chunk or all of their Power 5 conference teams in the first month of the season. No other team in the country has to do that. And that's simply because, Notre Dame, if you look at other sort of independent powers, they have these historic rivalries in place with Navy, with Michigan, with whomever. And so they don't have to do that as much. And Notre Dame and Michigan, I believe, now are playing the latest they've ever played in the season. It's like later in October, I think. And so that's just something that BYU has to deal with as an independent, that when you sort of, they're not sort of in that same realm of independence in a lot of ways as Notre Dame because of those historic rivalries.
The Athletic is where the piece is found today. Chantel wrote it. It's up there. It's called The Grass is Always Greener, inside the give and take of where they've kind of diverged, Utah and BYU post-Mountain West Conference. Again, I give you my daily, you should be subscribing to The Athletic right now. This piece, obviously Chris Camrani is now on the Utah beat full-time here in state of Utah. And, of course, our friend Tony Jones covers the Jazz beat too. So subscribe and put bread on Chantel and Chris and Tony's tables by patronizing The Athletic and get a lot of good content in return. All right, you weren't down in Hollywood yesterday, but I'm sure you followed some of the storylines coming out. Shocker of shockers, the Pac-12's moving to Las Vegas in 2020 to play their Pac-12 championship game. I think that's a better move, don't you?
Absolutely. If you look at Santa Clara versus Las Vegas, I think it was one of those, this was the worst kept secret in college football. Everyone knew this was kind of going to happen. And so I think moving to Las Vegas makes a lot of sense in terms of just getting butts in the seats, right? Because there are more people who want to get to Las Vegas than Santa Clara, and it's also less expensive to get to Las Vegas and stay in Las Vegas than it is to get to and stay in and around Santa Clara. And so I think I really haven't seen any negative reaction to this in terms of fans and what I saw on Twitter. I think people will be more excited even in these sort of matchups where, maybe last year was, I didn't get to see Utah play that much. Do I want to spend a few $100s on a ticket to the game and then a few $100s on a flight, and then staying in the Bay Area is super expensive and getting around is super expensive versus, you can get like $70 flights to Las Vegas from almost any city in the country. Staying there is inexpensive. Being there is fun. There's other things going on around the game for some of the over 21 crowd, obviously. But yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense. It's a good move for the conference. I'm excited to see how it goes.
I am too, and I think the thing that dovetails off this, obviously the Vegas Bowl now realigning is good too, but I think now Vegas is going to become that preseason destination too, Chantel, the same way that Mercedes-Benz Stadium is for the SEC or the ACC, or Jerry World has been for the Big 12 and the SEC. I think this new Vegas destination can kind of become the West Coast preseason big game version of a neutral site game for a Utah or an Oregon or a Washington to invite somebody from right now. It's like all these teams in the Southeast and back East invite teams from the West to come play in their neighborhood. I think now the Pac-12 can use Vegas as a destination to invite some of those teams out for a big, non-conference neutral site game that can generate some eyeballs.
Absolutely, and I think it's an easier sell too if you're talking to teams from other conferences to come out that way when you're talking about Las Vegas for all of the reasons that I mentioned earlier, but also just sort of having one of those marquee games in the West early in the season. I think it would help the Pac-12 as well, just because if you can get one of those games in your own footprint, in your own recruiting footprint, if you can get other teams to actually consider coming west of the Mississippi River for a big game, that just brings more eyeballs out west, which I think is something that is severely lacking right now.
Anything surprise you from the polls or anything that came out yesterday? Were you surprised that it was Utah that was picked to win the league and not an Oregon or a Washington?
No, because frankly, that would have been my pick. I think Oregon and Washington, being as close as they were, I think they had the same number of votes for the first place in the North. I thought maybe it would go to Oregon. That's kind of the boat that I'm in right now. But no, I thought everything else kind of shook out, and I don't put a ton of stock in preseason polls and all of the preseason lists. I know it's good fodder and it's good good conversation starters and all of that. I kind of glanced at it and went, oh yeah, okay, so that makes sense, about as much sense. I think what's most interesting is, this is really the first time since Utah joined the Pac-12 where they are the hunted and not the hunter. I'm curious to see, there's always sort of those cliches that go around, like, this doesn't change our approach, it doesn't change anything. But you've got to wonder, for those guys at Utah who maybe came in sort of as unheralded recruits or a little under the radar, to now be picked to win is a different position to be in. It's different, and I think different is good when it is in a good way. And so we'll see how they react to that, how they can handle that sort of pressure and that target on their back.
You can read her piece up at The Athletic today, and lots of other good college football stuff. David, is it Ubben or Ubben? Ubben's piece the other day on the craziness that was a decade ago, where the Big 12 and the Pac-12 almost kind of merged. That was a fantastic piece the other day, too. There's a lot of good college realignment stuff up there, and Chantel's piece on Utah and BYU is up there today as well.